well done everyone for getting through these first big sections. Now we're going to move into comparative argument analyses. You probably, a lot of you, depending on the school that your school is going, you probably already have your comparative argument analysis SAC. However, we'll go through this, and it also reinforces your argument, your knowledge of non-comparative structure, because if you can write this in the structure well, you can write a really good non-comparative argument analysis. Really important to be good at these, because VCA does not exclude completely the possibility that you could get this on the exam. And it has happened in the past. We will look at some screenshots of some examples that show what these tasks have looked like in the past. So essentially, it doesn't necessarily end at your SAC. You're not likely to get it. They haven't given them in like quite a few years. But you can never exclude the possibility, because VCA has never excluded the possibility of this happening. So you can be given 2, 3, or even 4+ pieces. The typical structure you see in schools is a main article, a second article, or some comments or some letters to the editor, and then a separate illustration as your comparative material. And these can be both written and visual, as we've established. And each piece has to be compared at least once to one other. You can never exclude any of your comparative material. So I can't just go and say, I'm not going to analyze one of these comments, So we see an example of what we've seen in the past on exam. This is an example where we have one longer article, a weekly column, one short letter in response, one cartoon. So if it's structured like this, what would you do? Probably makes sense to find comparative links just based on the main article, right? Because it's the only substantial length that we see. So I would plan everything out, find my 2 free arguments in this main article, then detail the argument of the letter, and then the argument of the cartoon. Use that to then be able to compare and find the differences and similarities based on argument, based on language, based on intended effect from what I've read and planned, and jot down, note points, some differences and similarities. So if I choose to start each body paragraph drawing on arguments of the main article and a discussion of those first, I might just decide for which argument is it more appropriate to bring in and compare my letter, for which argument is it more appropriate to bring in, make a link based on different similarities to my cartoon, and analyze that for a while, and compare and contrast the differences. And maybe there's an argument where I even think that both should be brought in. There should be a link to both. And of course, you might even find that the letter could be compared with the cartoon. So it really depends on the task. And that's what we're saying here. The way you approach the analysis depends on the material. So looking at this example, we see something completely different. It's an article with embedded images, so within, which means, we don't treat them as separate. They're not comparative materials. And 4 comments. So if you need to compare everything, what are you going to do? Probably some comments you will bring in and compare to the article, but some of the comments are going to be compared to each other. You'll be comparing and contrasting the comments themselves. And that's probably actually easier than this, in my opinion. Comments, very easy to analyze, and find the contentions of. Visual, much more subtle. So this is more of a SAC structure, kind of like I said, main piece, second piece, visual. If you see this typical structure, relying on that main piece to be the first discussion in each body paragraph makes a lot of sense, and then to bring in an argument from the second piece to contrast, or the visual to compare and contrast, up to you, but it's an easy, comprehensive structure to follow. We'll look at examples of the structure, guys, so don't worry about it. We'll get to it in the lecture. We're going to do some breakdowns. So why do we do this comparative analysis? Well, the VCA study design creates this expectation, and if they do give you a task where there are comparative materials and you do not analyze them, like a standalone visual or comments, you will not get a high scoring response. In past years where this has happened on the exam, though it's not likely to happen. Just be prepared for it. Um, to get high marks, you basically had to do it because it was intended as part of the task. So, some really important things to understand for comparative analysis and structure and writing it all up. Not splitting paragraphs by pieces. I feel like we have clearly established that it is just not comparative otherwise. So you can never just, this piece gets its own body paragraph. We can't do that. So we need to make connections, and also group your pieces into arguments or key players and find points of comparison through these. So that planning that I talked about, whether you're looking at stakeholders or distinct ideas or differences in language, differences in intended effect, dot point your similarities and differences, and you can only do that if you've read through the material, have a really good idea about what it's about, and plan out the arguments of all the materials. You need to compare as you write your essay. Just the transition to bring in another text or visual that you're about to kind of discuss for a while now and compare, it's not enough. You want to make links just a little bit more often. What I used to do, and this structure really worked for me, is bring in that transition based on a similarity and a difference, which we're going to look at today. Based on a similarity and a difference, then discuss, those maybe couple of pieces of evidence that you've chosen for that piece B, let's call it, and then have some discussion, just literally comparing based on what you've discussed of the evidence for that paragraph even further. Okay, so how is the intended effect different? What are some prominent differences and similarities? And having that discussion. And I would also use it to close my body paragraph. So kind of do 2 pieces per body paragraph. I didn't really do 3, but if I had maybe like really short comments, I could combine 3 as well. The more comparative links you can make, essentially, the better. Even if when you're analyzing a piece of evidence, you kind of think, oh, this is something I can compare as well, do it. So these are some really good sentence starters for you to keep in hand. Keep for yourself if you find it difficult to do transitions. So the best thing to do, we said, is introduce that transition based on a similarity and difference. So the main things that you will refer to is the language or the argument, either similarities or differences. The strongest link or transition you can make is noting both a similarity and a difference. And they have to be opposites. So if I note a similarity in the language, I will say, whereas there is a difference in the argument. I won't just say this language is similar, but then the tones are similar, but then they use different persuasive language techniques, right? So, for example, if I say that offer B also utilizes an appeal to fear to create blah, blah, blah effect. However, he also argues that some kind of nuance in the argument. Yes, maybe issue is bad, but something else should be done about it. So looking for, especially if you can find subtle, small differences, that's considered very valuable in English. So hopefully this slide really helps and gives you some sentence starters and ideas. We can compare literally everything: persuasive language techniques, approach to argument / tone, if tones are different, nuances in how the argument is either very different or just slightly, there's some subtle things there, intended effect, and targeting different audiences, literally everything you could think of, everything that's relevant to the material you've been presenting. So we're going to start seeing this in practice with intended effect to begin with. So we'll read these 2 letters addressing school strikes for climate change earlier, and compare the intended effect on the reader. So think about how they're similar and how they're different, which would allow us to make that comparative link. I went to the climate strike in Geelong. It was amazing to see so many students and so many parents and adults marching alongside them in support. These children loudly and clearly gave detailed speeches on what they expect from politicians. Unlike in my youth, they know what they want. They can see what change should look like. Finally, so can I. So that's Demopoulos. And Asplan says Peter Waterhouse cynically characterizes the climate demonstration as a vacuous virtue signaling exercise. Vacuous meaning pointless. Are the protesters really seeking approval rather than fighting for a cause? Vanity rather than conviction? I am more inclined to think people are protesting because there is genuine fear, especially amongst the school-age strikers, that unless governments act decisively now, we are heading towards an unlivable planet, as planned. So, similarities stands out. Both of them support the school strikes. The second one, hopefully, you didn't get confused because he was taking a quote and essentially refuting it and saying that this guy is wrong. He's a cynic. But both of them are in support for the school strikes, but for different reasons. So Demopulus is trying to say that the climate strikes have been bringing people together, and in particularly giving children, school-age protesters, empowerment and ability for political expression and feel that they can incite change. Whereas Aspland was instead saying that these school strikes are vital and we need to incite action now. Things are going badly. This has all been, large impact on the environment, and it's drastic action is necessary. So we see that here. Positions the audience to view children as empowered and politically engaged, whereas Aspland incites readers to demand decisive action from the government to curtail or prevent future consequences of climate change. And now we will look, how do you plan for comparative material with a short example, and how do you write up a body paragraph? So let's have a look. The following are comments in response to the rebuilding of the Notre Dame Cathedral after it was burnt by a fire. Again, think about also intended effect and also the contentions, how they're similar and different as we go along. Definitely take notes as we go along as well to get some practice in. Tuvi says the generous response to the call for donations to restore the Notre Dame Cathedral following the accidental fire of last week has been truly remarkable. But how best to use this money? Jesus often said to his disciples to feed my sheep, by which he meant look after my people like a shepherd does his sheep. I wonder what Jesus thinks about the money being used to restore the church to its former glory while homeless people sleep on the steps of sister churches the world over. Hayden says in the Middle Ages, the rich brought indulgences from the church to get out of purgatory early. Now, they chip in to fix up Notre Dame. Not much has changed, really, has it? Morris, I'd be happy for Australia to contribute to the rebuilding of Notre Dame once all of our refugees on Nauru and Manus are in Australia and awarded citizenship, along with all those in detention and on restricted visas. New Start is doubled, and those who are homeless are permanently housed. Your move. So we see that significant difference there. In Tuvi's one, there is lots of religious appeals and religious allusions. And he is discussing that essentially this is the un-Catholic thing to do, or un-Christian thing to do. Religiously, it is wrong to contribute to rebuilding this building when there are people, such as homeless people, that need the help, and it adopts this emotional tone. Hayden instead argues that the rich benefit from things like this and get to showcase their privilege or their pretend that they're moral and actually benefit from this, again making this a bad thing. All of them overall argue that the Notre Dame Cathedral should not be rebuilt. We see that similarity. What is Morris's argument? It should not be rebuilt until domestic issues in Australia are addressed. There are very serious domestic issues and other groups that could benefit from the funds. So have a look at this plan. I'm just going to take a second to grab a glass of water. All right. So basically what I said, but we can see that note point plan, how you could write it all up. Some interestingly as well, language choices, religious allusions, hypothetical references, and an empathetic tone into these piece. Um, Hayden was more referencing historical instances where the rich have always benefited from churches and other profitable ventures. There's a sardonic and critical tone. This is similar to Morris's sarcastic and challenging tone. Differences in persuasive language techniques continuing with Hayden using rhetorical questions and Morris using listing, more so, listing of all the problems in Australia. So that's a detailed plan. And then doing one by one practice analyses using our what, how, why method. Let's see an example. Tuvi analogizes Jesus' sheep with those who are vulnerable, such as homeless people. So an analogy is when we compare something to something else, sheep to homeless people in this case. This is a religious allusion. This positions readers to view homeless people as in need of guidance and support. And it suggests that those who have donated to Notre Dame are not abiding by religious teachings because they're overlooking what should take priority. And here we have our whole comparative paragraph. So won't read through everything, but there are some key things that I want you guys to get out of this. How can you start an argument? We talked about how you could base your arguments around your main article, but what if you have some short pieces of material like this? Start with a similarity. The authors all argue that funding to the Notre Dame may have been better spelled elsewhere. Then discuss our first piece. Here we're discussing Tuvi's piece and the religious values, and that's going to be different from anything else we choose to bring in from there. His was quite unique, and it wasn't attacking either. So then we bring in that transition or link that is comparative in nature, similarly focusing on humanitarian issues ignored by the Notre Dame donators. So some similarity in argument, but also the difference as well. And difference, of course, if the similarity was based on argument, we're focusing on a difference in language. So we say that Morris contrasts to the softer tone with her scathing critique of Australia's situation. So she has a scathing tone. Then we discuss the evidence and analyze it for a while. Similarly, you can, as you can see, in blue, pink, and yellow, that's the amount of discussion for each letter to the editor. You can choose how much you want to discuss each piece. It doesn't have to be equal. It doesn't have to be uniform. Of course, it's completely optional. So if you find one more interesting or you have more points to make, more interesting analysis, feel free to dedicate more body to it. And we see another comparative link. Utilizing a similarly aggressive tone to Morris, Hayden appeals to an audience of lower socioeconomic standing by aligning the donations to Notre Dame with the actions of the rich in the Middle Ages, a similarity in language, and then linked to a difference in the argument and which audience groups were being targeted. And you can see, based on these structures, you don't need to plainly state that you're introducing a difference. Use your signpost and write a buzzword. Whereas, on the other hand, contrast, contrastingly argue, it's all very easy. Or you can even use a sentence structure like this where if something is very clearly a difference based on your previous discussion, you don't even need to mention that it's a difference. You can make it clear that it's different. So comparative words not always crucial. Don't write saying offer B's argument is different to offer A because offer A talks about this and offer B talks about something else. Try to make it more implied, more easy to read, more concise. And then we see this final linking sentence after the discussion of the last letter to the editor, where you need to overall compare and contrast all of the pieces of text that you've kind of discussed in that body paragraph, whether it be 2 or 3. So as such, whilst Tuvi and Morris appeal broadly to a humanitarian audience, Hayden instead targets those disenfranchised by the actions of the global rich. So in this case, we see that was drawn directly from the comparative links that were made. Hopefully that